The next day I was summoned to Paulus at an unusual time. What could it mean? In the first room of the dugout I was greeted by the commander's personal orderly, Oberleutnant Zimmermann. "Thunderstorm, Mr. Colonel." The commander invited me to sit down, pointing to a chair against his desk. I felt that he is trying to contain the growing anger. "Yesterday in the Führer's headquarters you spoke with Zillberg about Schmidt?" "Yes, General." "Why did you do it without my knowledge?" "Because you, Herr General, would have forbidden me to take that step. But we could no longer see how Schmidt's self-rule was wearing you down." It seemed to me that the angry creases on my interlocutor's forehead smoothed out. He must have realized from my frank answer that we wished him well. "Who do you mean by we?" "We are all the chiefs of staff departments, especially the Chief of Operations, Chief of Engineers, Chief of Communications, Baron von Kutschenbach and me, Mr. General. I admit that you had the best of intentions. Nevertheless, you should have informed me beforehand, or at least done so immediately after your return last night. I apologize, Mr. General, for losing sight of that. I wanted to first discuss with your son-in-law and the department heads how we should proceed. It seemed to us expedient to convince you in a general conversation that in the interests of the Army Command you should part with Schmidt. Only after that I expected to report on the steps I had taken in Vinnitza. Who could have thought that you would so soon learn of my conversation with Zillberg? 10 minutes ago, I received a call from Colonel General Hulda. First he asked about the situation. Then he asked me directly who I wanted to replace Schmidt. He had learned from Blumentritt that personal relations between Schmidt and myself were by no means good. Then Hulda also referred to you. You can imagine my surprise. Of course, I declined the offer to replace the Chief of Staff under the circumstances. I understand that, General. Nevertheless, you should have decided to do so after the current operations were completed. I need only one thing from you. I say this once and for all. In the future, I must be aware of such plans in a timely manner. Generally speaking, this is not a matter for you, but for me. I wouldn't want Schmidt to know about this case. I hope we understand each other, Adam, and thus ended the Schmidt case. And unfortunately, I must say, if Paulus was not decisive and thirsty Faust, but Schmidt played in the army fatal role of Mephistopheles, this has shown bitter experience. How, by the way, is the case with your deputy? Asked the commander when I was about to leave. Everything is in order. I will be replaced by a lieutenant colonel from the personnel department. After my return, he will have to take our regiment. Then Schmidt will be satisfied. You know he can't get along with our Second Army Adjutant, Major von Lutitz. We were advancing again. The 4th Panzer Army crossed the Kalach-Stalingrad Railroad at Bazargino. It created a threat from the rear of the enemy, opposing the 6th Army. As a consequence, the Soviet units had to surrender the stubbornly defended line near the Rososhki River and retreat to the western outskirts of Stalingrad. Now also LI Army Corps went on the offensive. On September 2nd, the inner flanks of both armies converged near Yabloknoye and jointly continued to advance. The planned operation to encircle the enemy turned into a frontal offensive. The Tsaritsa River became the border between the armies. I had a lot of work in the following days. I wanted to prepare the organization of the officers' courses so that they could start working during my absence. First, a suitable place had to be found. The commandant of the army headquarters and the chief of communications travelled west of the Don several times to familiarize themselves with the area and suggested the village of Suvorovsky, south of Nizhny-Chirskaya. I went there together with the head of the training department. The barracks and bunkers located at the edge of the village could accommodate the cadets. The terrain was also suitable for our purposes. Thus, the choice fell on Suvorovsky. Infantry divisions were ordered to select experienced officers and non-commissioned officers as instructors. A young Captain Goebel of the 79th Infantry Division was appointed head of the school. Together with a pre-assigned team, he travelled to the site. The cadets were to arrive in late September or early October. All preparations had to be completed before that date. I made sure that the divisions had allocated the best of their young officers and non-commissioned officers, who took up the task with great zeal. Naturally, they were all glad of the opportunity to get away from the front line for a few weeks and get some sleep. Meanwhile, our divisions were moving step by step towards Stalingrad. On September 10, they reached the western outskirts of the city. From most of the wooden houses located on the steppe outskirts, only hulks of chimneys remained. But also adjoining from the side of the city, multi-story stone buildings were burned. Our troops settled down in cellars. Bloody battles for the city, for each house, hand-to-hand fighting began. "Commandant of Stalingrad." In these days, some colonel came to me and reported, "The General Command appointed me Commandant of Stalingrad and seconded me to the 6th Army. After presentation to the Army Commander, I would like to begin my duties." I smiled involuntarily. "You will probably have to be patient for a while. So far, our divisions are only fighting on the outskirts of the city." "Well, that won't last long," he said. "You are mistaken. It would take many, many days to recapture a single house here. Indeed, our tanks had already broken through to the Volga on August 23rd, but that doesn't mean they captured the city. In 2 weeks, we only reached the outskirts of the city. Introduce yourself first to Major General Schmidt, Chief of Army Staff. He'll better explain to you what's going on here." The colonel left with a disappointed look. I telephoned Schmidt and prepared him to receive this visitor. He laughed. When I added that the commandant of Stalingrad had already brought with him a whole staff of employees, Schmidt just got angry. "What do we need these people here for? The commandant of a city that has not yet been taken. This is ridiculous. I will suggest Paulus to send these gentlemen back to Army Group B. Contact the adjutant there now and prepare him for that." My colleague in Army Group agreed with Schmidt's suggestion. Both of us were agreed that this elderly colonel, filled with service zeal, nothing to reproach. But why does the General Command of Land Forces compromise itself? Do they still think that the Red Army is defeated, and that the capture of this huge city is something like an exciting walk? What good are our daily reports on the situation and casualties anyway, if episodes like this can happen? Accounting teams and oil brigades. Another incident got me thinking. Around the same time, many officers and soldiers arrived at our headquarters. They called themselves the accounting team. What the hell is this? The explanation was given to us by the chief quartermaster of the army. It turns out that these people, specialists in metallurgy, which should be taken on the army allowance, they received instructions and orders directly from the Führer's headquarters and were to enter the city after the troops. Their task, at the large factories to take into account equipment, semi-finished products and raw materials, especially non-ferrous metals, and all this immediately sent to the rear. During my next report to the commander, Paulus touched on this topic. "Well, Adam, what do you say about our newest replenishment?" he said, smiling. "Not much will be able to take into account these people. The aviation is destroying everything. The factories are nothing but piles of rubble. And who will loot here in the end? The soldiers are busy with other things. Are these new arrivals really soldiers or just civilians hastily dressed in uniforms, Mr. General?" That's a question I can't answer, unfortunately. The main thing is that they do not interfere with our operations. But they will probably demand transportation for themselves, General. Maybe they have their own convoys of trucks. I don't know. By the way, the Army Group A, which is advancing to the Caucasus, is followed by the same teams, which will have to deal with the operation of oil pipelines in Maikop and Grozny, and then in Baku. Paulus left to Major General Schmidt. I did not get out of my head recent conversation with the commander. I remembered one place from Goebbels' speech or article. This war for grain and bread, war for raw materials, for rubber, for iron and ore. Something similar had already been stated by Adolf Hitler in his book Mein Kampf, discussing German agrarian policy in Russia. The achievement of these military goals was undoubtedly to be achieved by accounting teams and oil brigades. I have in my memory a conversation which I had in the spring in Poltava with a wordy Sonderführer from some economic headquarters east. At that time I gave little thought to his story about the branches of the Mannesmann concern in Kiev and Dnepropetrovsk, about the joint stock company Siemens Ukraine, and about the main board of Friedrich Krupp's firm in Ukraine. I finally remembered and repeatedly repeated in the headquarters of our army statement, as if the persons awarded the Knight's Cross, after the end of the war, will receive a gift from the Führer estates in the eastern regions. As a matter of fact, all this did not agree well with the thesis which had been constantly hammered into us from the very beginning of the march to the east. According to this thesis, the struggle against the Soviet Union was supposedly an inevitable preventive war against the spread of Bolshevism in Germany. Something was amiss here. But what was the point? In any case, I reassured myself at the time, I was not responsible for it. The offensive continued. On September 14th and 15, German divisions managed to penetrate deeper into Stalingrad. Bloody battles were played out at the station Stalingrad 1 and on Mamayev Kurgan, height 102. Only on September 14th, the station changed hands 5 times. From Mamayev Kurgan, the whole city was visible, including wharves and large industrial enterprises in the northern part of Stalingrad, Red October, Barricade, and Tractor Factory. For 60 kilometers stretched the territory of the city crossed by deep ravines, a labyrinth of houses, streets, and squares, a wide ribbon of the Volga River in the distance. In the south, the forested island Hungary towered above the river. On the other bank, one could notice the village of Krasnaya Sloboda, the main supply base for the Soviet troops fighting in the city. It is clear that the Russians did not abandon attempts to repel Mamayev Kurgan, dominating the area. On September 16th, they succeeded. Despite repeated attempts, accompanied by heavy losses on our part, for the next 10 days it was possible to occupy only half of this hill. By September 27th, the 4th Tank Army and LI Army Corps occupied the area of the city adjacent to the Tsaritsa River from the south, including the Volga coast. In the center of Stalingrad and in its northern part, the Russians still held strong positions, even though we had brought in our last reserves. The most important part of the city, along with the crossing to the Soviet ammunition and food supply base on the east bank of the Volga, remained in the hands of the defenders of the city. Point of September 12th, Colonel General von Weichs, commander of Army Group B, and General Paulus were summoned to Vinitsa for a meeting at Hitler's headquarters. Paulus reported on the situation at the front. Especially insistent, he pointed out the threat to the northern flank of the army. Hitler did not want to reckon with these concerns. He invariably repeated his stereotypical phrase that the Red Army is defeated. Resistance in Stalingrad has only local significance. In addition, he said, all measures have been taken to cover the northern flank. Now the task of the Sixth Army, to concentrate all forces for the early capture of the city. Instead of additionally requested by Paulus combat-ready 3 divisions, he was given only XXXXT2 Tank Corps, formerly part of the 4th Tank Army. The 4th Tank Army itself was removed from the front of the offensive at Stalingrad. The 6th Army is to conduct operations throughout the city. Extremely discouraged, General Paulus showed me the order of the army group. This is called Strengthen the Army. These divisions are exhausted absolutely as well as ours. And since I simultaneously have to occupy 2 new areas of divisions of the 4th Panzer Army divisions, in fact, at my disposal came only 1 very weakened division. Arrived from the personnel department my deputy. When I handed him the cases at the command post, we decided together to go around some infantry divisions. On the eve of my departure for Germany, we set off at 7 o'clock in the morning. Although it was already the middle of September, the weather was warm and windless. Our bombers, escorted by skittish fighters, were continuously flying across the cloudless sky toward the city. We could watch through binoculars as the attack aircraft dropped their deadly cargo from a great height, and dive bombers were crashing into the thick clouds of smoke that constantly hung over the burning Stalingrad. The ruptures shook the air, heralding new wounds to the city and its defenders. I had no idea that the Russians were capable of resisting so stubbornly. We were all of the opinion that the whole city would be taken within a few days, said my companion, who was seeing for the first time what was happening here. You are not the first representative of the High Command to tell us that. We are convinced every time that the High Command misjudges the Russians. This could cost us dearly. We entered Gumrak. I knew that somewhere here must be a divisional medical centre. While we were looking for it, we noticed that at a distance of more than a kilometre east of the village took positions several of our artillery batteries. They were firing continuously. The enemy replied with heavy guns. In dangerous proximity to us, flew into the air rocks and shrapnel. The rumble from the bursting shells was so strong that we had to almost shout to hear each other. There was also the divisional infirmary, a large building near the station, which could be recognised by the flag with a red cross. Continuously, the wounded were arriving in ambulances, in trucks and horse-drawn wagons. Not all lay on stretchers. Some had a wool blanket as a bedding, while others just lay on the bottom of the truck. In a rather large room, surgeons and their assistants worked at 2 operating tables. First of all, amputations were performed, and care was given to those wounded in the throat. Then it was the turn of those wounded in the stomach and lungs. As a matter of fact, preference should have been given to those wounded in the stomach. But such operations lasted from 2 to 3 hours, and there was little chance of success. Meanwhile, during the same 2 or 3 hours, doctors could perform a large number of such amputations, when with timely surgical intervention, the threat of a fatal outcome was not so great. We did not interfere and only looked into the operating room. As we stood at the door, an orderly passed us. He was carrying a bucket with bloody bandages, shreds of underwear and uniforms. A wax leg stump with black and blue veins was sticking out of the bucket. A young man who was lying under anaesthesia on the table had had his leg amputated. The surgeon was just putting clamps on the vessels in the rest of the thigh, and 2 orderlies were standing by with gauze and bandages to apply a bandage. Truth be told, what we saw was enough. But then the foreman of the sanitary company came up to us and took us to the next room, where the seriously wounded were waiting to be sent to the rear of the army or to the homeland. They were lying on mattresses, on grass bedding, or just on the floor. A horrifying picture of human suffering. Young, sturdy men turned into cripples. The field sergeant pointed to a soldier whose head was almost entirely covered with bandages. Only his mouth and nose were visible. A 19-year-old gymnasium student, blind, but he doesn't know it yet. He asks everyone if he can see. In delirium calls for his mother. The other room we looked into was also filled with cripples. Like everywhere else, it smelled of ether, pus and blood. But there were a few iron beds, so that the room looked more like an infirmary. A young doctor was making his rounds. At the very door lay a man with an amputated leg, an infantryman who had had his left shin shattered by a hand grenade during the street fighting. We sat down beside him. First, we gave away all our cigarettes. Then, when the wounded smoked, we started talking. It's hell on the front lines. I've never seen anything like it in this war. I've been in it from the beginning. Ivan's not backing down a step. The road to the Russian positions is lined with their corpses, but many of ours will die before them. In fact, there are no real positions here. They're fighting over every ruin, every rock. Death is waiting for us everywhere. You can't achieve anything here with a frantic charge. You'd rather lay down your head. We must learn to fight with bayonets. Yes, said his bunkmate, a non-commissioned officer with the Iron Cross of the First Degree, as we noticed during the conversation. We must learn this from the Russians. They are masters of street fighting. They know how to use every pile of stones, every ledge on the wall, every cellar. This I did not expect from them. An elderly soldier intervened in the conversation. I can only confirm what they both said, Mr. Colonel. After all, it becomes ridiculous when the soldiers' newspapers write that the Russian has completely lost strength, is not capable of resistance. If Mr. Editors had stayed with us for a day or two, they would have stopped their nonsense. Until now, we have laughed at the Russians, the non-commissioned officer spoke again, but now it is the past. In Stalingrad, many of us have learned not to laugh. The worst is the night fighting. If we manage to capture some ruins or one side of a street during the day, the enemy will attack us at night. If we are not alert, he drives us out again. I'm afraid it will take us months before we have the whole city in our hands, if we can manage it at all. Our company, said an elderly soldier, has suffered casualties as heavy as I have never seen in any of my units all through the war. When I was wounded, there were 21 more of us, but they were tired and exhausted, so we're not likely to get a step further. In the end, no one would be left alive at all. We looked around the room. Everyone nodded their heads in agreement. It was more than instructive, especially for my deputy, who arrived in Stalingrad, still retaining the illusions of the main apartment. The petty officer of the sanitary company confirmed, "Mr. Colonel, that's what everyone says. It must be terrible at the front line. You can see it by the fact that many, many wounded are being brought in day and night. Our doctors are working to exhaustion. They don't have time to eat or sleep. Look at our chief doctor. He can barely stand on his feet." Before leaving, we opened the door to the operating room again. The head doctor nodded tiredly at us. Then he bent over the operating table again to snatch another victim from the war, or at least to try to do so. Silently we got into the car. I still wanted to acquaint my deputy with the nearby headquarters of the LI Army Corps and then drive to the location of the Uaid and the Army Corps. During the short meetings we had there, we saw only serious, anxious faces. Even General von Seydlitz, who was distinguished for his indestructible courage, appeared to be dejected. Colonel Clausius, his chief of staff, told us, "With only such shabby divisions, we can do nothing with a fiercely fighting enemy. We lack striking power. In addition, our divisions report that the Guards division of the enemy transferred here has entered the battle. There are also sailors." "This report is transmitted to the Army headquarters?" I asked. "Of course. I have already informed the head of the operational department of the Army. We were in a hurry. We had to go on. In the 8th Army Corps, we met with the adjutant, who briefed us on the situation. Toward the end, we saw General Strecker, commander of the XI Army Corps. In his area in recent days has become somewhat calmer. However, Strecker was concerned about the situation on the left flank, the Italians. They clearly lacked arms and equipment. By evening, we were returning to Pigeons, and I reported to Paulus and Schmidt that my deputy accepted the cases. I then requested permission to depart for a 4-week treatment in Falkenstein. For the 3rd time in 5 weeks, I flew by airplane through Kharkov to Vinnytsia. This time I was going to Germany. I breathed a sigh of relief when in Vinnytsia I boarded the scheduled train to Berlin. Comfortably seated on a comfortable sofa in the first-class car, I looked at the colourful autumn landscape passing by outside the window. I didn't even think about the partisans. I was immersed in thoughts of my forthcoming rendezvous with my wife and daughter, of 4 carefree weeks in my native land. In Berlin, I immediately boarded the train to Frankfurt am Main. The compartment was already occupied by 4 young officers who were returning to Paris via Frankfurt. They were Berliners, jolly fellows who chatted about theatre and movies, their girlfriends and friends, outings and amusements, but not a word about the war. Sitting opposite me was an elderly officer, a lieutenant colonel. Like me, a smile flashed across his face every now and then when one of the lieutenants told me about a particularly amusing adventure. Several times our gazes met. Finally he spoke to me. "Are you coming from the east, Mr. Colonel?" "Yes, from Stalingrad," I answered quietly, so as not to disturb the merriment of the young men. Apparently, I did not speak quietly enough. The conversation of the young people broke off at once. Everyone listened and looked at me expectantly. And in Germany the word Stalingrad took on a special meaning. A blonde infantry lieutenant remarked, "After all, Paulus is an outstanding commander. He's already given the Russians a good beating. Probably he will drive their last detachments into the Volga." "Have you ever been on the Eastern Front?" I asked irritably. "No, Mr. Colonel. My unit is in France." Somewhat embarrassed, he replied. In short words, I described to them the bloody fighting in the city on the Volga. The elated mood was replaced by confusion. I really thought that the Russians were finished. It's written in all the newspapers, shouted in all the news reels and radio programs, as if apologizing, said the lieutenant. Another added, "Apparently, we have a completely false idea of the fighting in the East. In Berlin, I spoke with an acquaintance. He is exactly the same as you, Mr. Colonel, talked about our campaign in the Caucasus and about Stalingrad. I thought he was lying, so I did not take his words seriously. Now I see that he was not exaggerating." The subject of war put an end to the merry chatter. Now the conversation turned to memories of hard fighting, of fallen comrades, friends and relatives. I was dissatisfied with myself that against my will this had happened. So I said, "That's enough, friends. Let's get back to more pleasant topics. After all, I'm going on vacation for 4 weeks. Isn't that a reason to be happy?" Everyone, though, tried to dispel the gloomy thoughts, but they all got discouraged. With a firm handshake, we parted at the main station in Frankfurt am Main. From there, I had to go on to Kronberg in Taunus. I still had more than 2 hours to spare. From the station post office, I called the officers' rest home in Falkenstein. A friendly voice answered that a car would be sent for me to Kronberg. After this telephone conversation, I headed for the exit of the station. I knew Frankfurt well from past times. The wonderful old part of the city with the town hall known as the Remer, the house where Goethe was born, St. Paul's Cathedral, the main business street, and the university. Back then, this commercial capital was bustling with life. Until late at night, snivel back and forth and crowded people on the brightly lit Kaiserstrasse, the Zeil Street with its large stores, hotels, restaurants, cafes and entertainment venues. The once familiar picture has changed in many ways. Gone was the motley flow of people. The grey colour of marching uniforms prevailed. I was particularly struck by the multitude of legless people. I was looking at a store window when a young lieutenant waddled past. I could see how difficult it was for him to move. I spoke to him about it. He replied that he had just received his prosthesis today. Frankfurt has become the centre of the prosthetic industry. That's why there are so many war invalids here. Goethe University, I read on the white enamel sign. So this was one of the university faculties. I was reminded of my university years. Are the professors from whom I listened to lectures on mathematics in the 20s still alive and working? Schönflies, he was rector then. Epstein, it's been 20 years. I had no idea about Stalingrad then. It was time to go back to the station. The steam locomotive was already standing under steam. I went through several cars until I found an almost empty second-class compartment. There was only one young officer sitting at the window. To my surprise, it was an acquaintance of mine, a lieutenant with an amputated leg, with whom I had spoken shortly before on the Kaiserstrasse. I soon learned that he was serving in the 39th Infantry Regiment in Düsseldorf. It even turned out that we had a mutual friend in that regiment, Lieutenant Foltz, who had died during the campaign to the west. Of course, I asked where my travelling companion was going. "To Falkenstein," he replied. "I am being treated there. I presume, Herr Colonel, that you are going there also. You have guessed it, my young friend." The lieutenant stood up and introduced himself, and I called my name too. "Now I know who you are, Mr. Colonel. You were a tactics teacher. Foltz has told me a lot about you." "Nothing bad, I hope." "Of course not. He also told me about your son Heinz, who unfortunately also died in France. I'm his age." I looked at him in silence. He immediately changed the subject. "The next station is Kronberg, Mr. Colonel. That's where we'll get off. It's another hour's walk from the station to Falkenstein. I've ordered a car through the doctor in charge. We'll go together. The chauffeur was waiting for me on the platform. After putting my suitcase in the trunk, we set off. The dark contours of the Taunus Mountains stood out sharply against the sky. The golden disk of the sun was already quite low above the horizon. I breathed in the fragrant mountain air, the air of my homeland. How often I used to wander here with a cheerful group, with a full rucksack on my back. I especially loved the road along the crest of the mountains from Nauheim to Neuwied, on the Rhine along the Dimes, the old Roman frontier fortifications, whose watchtowers and castles could still be recognized everywhere. We raced towards the Falkenstein resort. The rest house was on the outskirts, right next to the forest. The car drove straight through the open gate to a large building with a wide porch. Here was the office. To the left and right of it stood newly built smaller buildings. Around it there was a garden, where autumn flowers were still preserved in their splendour. "Here we are," said my travelling companion. "If you allow me, I will show you everything here tomorrow. Now we must go upstairs to the office. They're waiting for you." On the porch stood an officer, as it turned out, the regimental doctor. He was the chief physician of the rest home. He greeted me cordially. In the cosily furnished lobby, I was received by a graceful nurse. The doctor bade me farewell, saying, "Proceed first to your room, Mr. Colonel. When you have freshened up a little, the nurse will show you to the emergency room. Then we will meet you in the dining room for dinner. Then I will introduce you to our other guests." I went down to the basement with my sister. A long lighted corridor opened up before us. "What is this place?" I asked. The girl, smiling, answered, "This is how all our rest houses are arranged. You probably notice that there are 3 houses on either side, so they are connected by this tunnel to the main building. Here are the baths and treatment rooms. In the morning, you can walk right into the bathroom in your pyjamas and bathrobe. Yes, it's really very comfortable. Just a few more steps upstairs and we're there," said my sister. I soon found myself in a large, bright room that was well and tastefully furnished. My luggage had already been brought in. Through the half-open door I stepped out onto the balcony. It was getting dusk. A light haze had descended over the forest. There was a marvellous silence. It was hard for me to get used to the idea that there was still such beauty, when every second in 2,500 kilometres to the east of here, hundreds of human bodies are maimed and cut up, where the thunder of guns and the rumble of exploding shells drown out the groans of the wounded and the wheezing of the dying. Quietly shutting the door, I returned to the room. The nurse had stealthily gone out. I had just half an hour to wash off the dust of the journey and complete the formalities of registration, and the gong was already calling for dinner. All the vacationers were gathered in the dining room when I came in with the doctor. At my request, I was seated at the same table with a Düsseldorf lieutenant. My other table-mate was Oberleutnant Jacobi, a young Berliner. He, too, had lost a leg, but managed to retain his inherent humour. I soon became completely acclimatized. We took daily short walks in the woods or sat in the park under the gentle rays of the fall sun. The days of rest would have passed quite carefree without one theme, the theme of Stalingrad. Every day I eagerly awaited the Wehrmacht bulletin. Every day it mentioned the name of this city. But what I wanted to hear was, "Stalingrad has fallen," was not in the bulletin. When 2 weeks later the desired news still hadn't arrived, my anxiety increased. To my surprise, all my interlocutors, even the villagers, had great confidence in General Paulus. "He will do well. Then, hopefully, the war will soon be over," said to me an old peasant with whom I often talked. However, Paulus himself at the end of September, in response to a postcard sent to him, wrote to me, "Everything is still the same." The very next day after my arrival in Falkenstein, my wife and daughter visited me. Unfortunately, the joy of the visit was poisoned. My mother-in-law was dying. She had been lying paralysed for a long time in a sanatorium near Darmstadt. I had the opportunity to see her a few days before she closed her eyes forever. After her death, my wife and daughter settled in Falkenstein for the duration of my treatment. Together with them and both young officers, I went one day to Frankfurt. Oberleutnant Jacobi suggested that we go to the movies. He probably wanted to distract me from thoughts of Stalingrad. And to feel freer, all three of us put on civilian clothes. On her first visit, my wife brought me everything I needed. The chief doctor gave us a whole day's vacation. In a horse-drawn carriage, we travelled to the train station in Kronberg. "It's like a trip to the country," my wife remarked, laughing. "Almost like 10 years ago, when we used to ride in the carriage of the 3rd Cavalry Division from Weimar to Tiefurt, Belvedere, Bad Berka, or the Ettisberg. How good it was then." From the train window we watched the work in the fields. The potato harvest was in full swing. There were women and children working everywhere, some of them old men. But no, there were young men, French prisoners of war. The main burden of work rested on the shoulders of the women. They hauled sacks weighing a centner to the wagons. They walked behind the plough pulled by stubborn oxen, and they drove the prisoners of war, who often had no idea of agriculture. Just as we disembarked at the central station in Frankfurt, a train of vacationers arrived there. With excitement, women and children squeezed through the barriers. The first groups of soldiers, laden with tightly packed shoulder bags and all sorts of things, came out of the cars. Officers dragged heavy suitcases. This train with vacationers could only come from France or Belgium. What the fathers, husbands and sons had not brought with them. The thought of this undoubtedly increased the joy of the meeting, which was evidenced by joyous exclamations, hugs and tears. 14 days of vacation were 14 days of celebration. How could one think of the fact that these beautiful, rare things, bought with depreciated occupation money, were, so to speak, legally stolen from the French or Belgians? A different spectacle were the scenes of farewell on the other platform. On a shield I read the words, "Frankfurt am Main, Dresden, Krakow." That was the train that was going to the Eastern Front. And here the soldiers were holding the hand of their wives or mothers who had come with their children. Silently they stood at the fence. Many women had tears rolling down their pale cheeks. "Will he come back?" they asked themselves. "Is this the last time we see his dear face?" And what then? Why did we need this war? Sneaking a glance at my wife, and she had tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. I knew she was thinking about our only son Heinz, who had died in France 2 years ago. Thoughts of him naturally echoed thoughts of me. In a few days she would again stand at this station and look after the train that was taking me to the east. What fate awaits me? She said, "How much suffering and misery this unfortunate war has already brought us, with no end in sight." We walked along the Kaiserstrasse. As 2 weeks ago, in the days of my arrival, the crowd was dominated by grey overcoats. But today it struck me that there were also many brown and black uniforms. They were Amtsleiterers and Blockleiterers, young men from the security squads and SS men. "Here even the stones and walls have ears," whispered the wife. "One critical remark, spoken too loudly, and you can be arrested immediately. In Frankfurt this is particularly acute. You have to be very careful here." "Isn't that why you are so fearful and stingy with words?" I asked. "You always told me to be careful. Dissenters are not treated with much ceremony these days." We agreed to meet the 2 officers, who had difficulty walking in the streets because of their prosthetic limbs, for lunch at the Frankfurter Hof restaurant. It was already past noon when we got there. It was not always possible to find a free place there before, but now there were only a few tables occupied. Our companions were already waiting for us. At a neighbouring table sat 2 men and 2 women, apparently married couples. They looked to me to be in their 50s. I would not have paid much attention to them if I had not heard the word Stalingrad spoken at their table. Scraps of conversation reached me. Our son wrote, "An officer. Very heavy fighting. Heavy losses. The Russians are not surrendering a single metre of ground without a fight. The city is a pile of ruins." One of the women, probably the mother of the one who wrote the letters, had tears in her eyes. Her husband stroked her hand. "Don't worry, Mother, because he is still alive." After lunch, we went to the movies. In this theatre at the Eschenheimer Turm there was some insignificant movie going on. I had long ago forgotten its title, and in fact we were mainly interested in newsreels. We still had plenty of time, so we went to the movie on foot. I looked anxiously at Oberleutnant Jacobi. Something was wrong with his prosthesis. But Jacobi laughed jovially when I suggested that we walk a little slower. At the movie theatre box office, we only got 5 box seats. Tickets for afternoon shows were almost always sold out, but in the evening the theatres were empty. This was due to the fact that at that time Anglo-American pilots had not yet raided Frankfurt during the day. The show began with a newsreel. Those were shots from the Eastern Theatre of War, showed us and burning Stalingrad. As on the training ground, German soldiers moved forward quickly. As on a drill, they fired a few shots, and the enemy soldiers fled. Wow, where was this filmed? The audience, among them were many wounded soldiers, squirmed. There were whistles, laughter, exclamations, lies. Yes, it was too much. The gravity of the bloody battles was simply concealed, falsely twisting the truth. In the darkened auditorium, outraged cries and curses sounded even louder. Suddenly there was a commotion. Someone was taken out of the row in which he was sitting, then pushed into a side aisle. The security squads went about their business. There were some protesting voices. Then there was dead silence. Fear had taken over the truth. I walked out of the movie theatre with my companions in thought. The days in Falkenstein flew by in a flash. Baths, forest air, peace and fellowship with loved ones. All this gave me new strength. However, the doctor was not satisfied with the results of the treatment and suggested extending the course. I refused. Paulus wrote that he was waiting for me at the appointed time, thus had to end the vacation. October 16th, I spent with my wife, daughter and new friends the last minutes on the platform of the Frankfurt train station. A farewell wave of the hand from the car window, and the train moved. In Berlin, I took a courier train to Vinica, and from there I flew by airplane to Golubinski. My deputy came to the airfield to pick me up. Already on the way to Golubinski, I learned about the changes in the headquarters that had occurred during my absence. My friend Felter was moved to the post of Chief of Staff of an army corps outside our army. The Oberquartermeister, the head of the intelligence department and the head of the army sanitary service were also replaced. But on the Stalingrad front, no significant changes occurred. Only on the northern outskirts of the city German divisions managed to push back the Red Army units from the western protrusion above Orlovka, take the tractor factory and make their way to the Volga. Around the factories, Barricadi and Red October, fierce fighting was going on. Our losses increased again. They could not even approximately be replenished by the arrival of several marching battalions. First, I introduced myself to Major General Schmidt. During the conversation, he showed his usual optimism, but showing the situation on the operational map, and he did not hide his disappointment. In the city, we were treading on the ground. It was impossible to foresee when these exhausting battles would end. The enemy almost continuously attacked our divisions between the Don and the Volga. Following this, I went to Paulus. He had already been informed of my arrival. The first question he asked me after my report was the following. "What do you say about the removal of Galder?" I still had not heard about it at all. Extremely surprised, I asked, "And when was Colonel General Galder dismissed, Herr General?" "On September 24th. He was succeeded by Infantry General Zeitzler. Obviously, Paulus took these changes in the General Staff to heart. He has long worked together with Galder, was his deputy and highly valued him." "Do you know why Galder was removed from his post, Mr. General?" "Of course not." "True, I remember that Galder repeatedly in my presence objected to Hitler and expressed his own opinion. But tell me now, what are your impressions of Germany and how you rested? I stayed with Paulus for a long time. He didn't interrupt me. I told him and that I had heard many times in Germany. The commander of the Sixth Army will quickly cope with the Russians. Then the war will come to an end. Paulus smiled tiredly. That would be good, Adam, but so far we are very far from that. The High Command is still dismissive of our warnings regarding the northern flank. Meanwhile, the situation has now become even more serious. A few days ago, I received from the 44th Infantry Division alarming reports about the situation in the northern bend of the Don. There is a transfer of large groups of Soviet troops from east to west. They are concentrating units in this area. About the same reports, 376th Infantry Division. Apparently, the enemy is preparing to strike a blow with deep coverage of our flank. And I have no forces to counter the deadly threat. Our divisions are bleeding to death in Stalingrad. The General Command of Land Forces, on the one hand, does not allow me to suspend the offensive on the city, and on the other, does not give me requested 3 new combat-ready divisions. We were given only 5 engineer battalions, as if they are able to take the city. With bitterness, said Paulus' last words. His face now twitched more than usual. Even before my meeting with the general, Oberleutnant Zimmermann told me in passing that he did not like the general feeling of Paulus. A stomach ailment is making itself known. Alarming news followed one after another. I said goodbye to Paulus with mixed feelings. The officer who replaced me during my leave was already waiting for me at headquarters, and I intended to immediately begin my duties. Everything was ready for the transfer of business. The mail from the General Staff had been piled up in a single folder during my absence. It interested me in the first place. I therefore asked the Lieutenant Colonel to brief me orally. I decided to study the cases in detail in the coming days. Let's start with the curiosities, said the Lieutenant Colonel. Last week the Rate sent us a famous Leipzig battle painter. He is going to make sketches and then depict the Battle of Stalingrad on a large canvas. We sent him to General von Seydlitz, who can best familiarize him with the areas where the most lively battles were fought. The artist wants to make sketches for a gigantic painting, which he will paint in his Leipzig studio at Hitler's request. Can we take responsibility for the risk he faces at the front? I asked. The artist is not an old man anymore, wears a grey overcoat. He works hard. Probably you will meet him during a trip to the LI Army Corps, replied the Lieutenant Colonel. Well, what else do you have? I hurried him up. When you on the way from the airfield told me about your impressions at home, I remembered a recent order of the Führer's headquarters. According to this order, we must soldiers, non-commissioned officers and young officers who received for bravery in the Battle of Stalingrad, the Knight's Cross, or the German Cross in gold, systematically send to Hitler for a report. The first of these, a lieutenant, returned 4 days ago. He informed me that Hitler received him very graciously. The lieutenant then went on the radio to give an account of his impressions, for which he received an unusually high fee. The newspapers published the story with a portrait of the author. Propaganda at the front is also not lagging behind. In the soldiers' newspaper, published in Kiev, constantly appear enthusiastic descriptions of battles, belonging to the pen Sonderführer Fritzsche. No expense is spared to raise morale, and they are not very choosy about funds. Anyway, there's a system here too. As long as we have not taken Stalingrad, we need some kind of surrogate, even if it is only sophisticated propaganda. But I have the impression that it often fails both at the front and in the rear. There are more and more people who are war-weary. The number of disbelievers is growing. Certainly, if the city were finally taken, the mood would change for the better. Here, by the way, is a letter from the General Command of the Land Forces, which bends in the same direction. On Hitler's initiative should be approved Stalingrad Medal on the model of the Crimean and Narvik medals. The army is ordered to submit proposals for the design of this commemorative sign no later than November 25th. At this minute, Paulus entered. We stood up. "Sit down, gentlemen. I won't disturb you. I was passing by on the street and heard from Chief Field Fleebel Cooper that you are still working. I thought I'd drop in for a moment." "What is this letter in your hand?" I handed Paulus a letter regarding the Stalingrad medal. "It's a sad episode. We haven't taken half the city yet, and we're standing at the precipice. With the current combat effectiveness of the troops, it is difficult to even assert that we will ever reach the goal. The High Command does not think about it. Instead, we are approached with such unfounded premature projects, such as the Stalingrad medal." After a moment's silence, Paulus said, "You will be interested to know, Adam, that one artist from the propaganda department has already made a sketch of the medal, and you will later have to prepare proposals on whom to present for the award. Even today, I hate to think about it, Mr. General, but I'm even more upset that we've made so little progress. When I left for medical treatment 5 weeks ago, I hoped that when I returned, I wouldn't find the headquarters here. Meanwhile, in fact, everything has remained the same. In 3 years of war, I have not yet encountered such a situation. You know that the number of our divisions in most cases fell to the level of a regiment," said Paulus. "But this is not the only reason. The resistance of the Red Army in recent weeks has reached a strength that we never expected. Not one of our soldiers or officers now does not speak disparagingly about Ivan, although not so long ago they said so often. The Red Army soldier acts more and more every day as a master of close combat, street battles, and skillful camouflage. Our artillery and aviation before each attack literally plough over the terrain occupied by the enemy. But as soon as our infantrymen come out of hiding, they are met with devastating fire. If we achieve success in some place, as the Russians immediately strike back, which often throws us back to the original position." Thinking for a moment, Paulus continued, "The enemy command also acts more purposeful. We have the impression that the Soviet command intends to hold their positions on the west bank of the Volga at any cost. In some places, the defensive strip occupied by the Russians is no more than 100 or 200 meters wide. If we believe the testimony of prisoners, the headquarters of the 62nd Army even located its command post on the steep western bank. Since mid-September, the commander of this army is as if General Chuikov. More and more often, he manages to move new divisions across the Volga. His combat effectiveness is increasing. Ours is decreasing. 5 sapper battalions sent to us during the offensive in the northern part of the city suffered such heavy losses that we were forced to withdraw them from the battle. Undoubtedly, the enemy is also experiencing great difficulties. The prisoners have shown that the 62nd Army is supplied at night across the Volga. However, since the army has no vehicles or horses on the west bank, weapons, ammunition and food have to be carried by hand from the unloading point to the positions. Thus the troops do not rest day or night. After unloading the boats, the wounded and sick are sent to the eastern shore on them. So far we have not succeeded in capturing a crossing place or blocking the river. But these are the same men, Mr. General, whom we've been forcing to retreat for a month. How do you explain this sudden, fierce resistance? I've already told you that the command has become more determined. Apparently, General Chuikov is a very energetic commander. It was already late. We escorted the commander through the village street, which was plunged into darkness. Together with the officer who was waiting for him, the general went to the small house where he lived. And we returned to our business. The lieutenant colonel again took the folder with papers in his hands. I would like to mention another event of the general staff. It also shows that in Berlin or in Vinitsa, illusions are substituted for the real assessment of the situation. In early October, the General of Engineers arrived at the headquarters of the 6th Army at the head of the department for the construction of long-term fortifications, 2 staffs of engineer regiments, 6 staffs of engineer battalions, and 1 construction company. The General Command of Land Forces entrusted them to erect concrete fortifications in Stalingrad. The head of the engineering service of our army, Colonel Zell, lost his temper when he heard about this absurdity. Cement, gravel, and Timber are needed to build bunkers. I admit that gravel can be mined on the Volga or Don, but cement and timber have to be brought hundreds of kilometers away, even if it were all possible, because there is no labor force necessary for construction. In the close battle for the city, the sapper battalions were badly damaged, and besides, the Russians will certainly not passively watch us build concrete fortifications. Zell proposed to the Chief of Staff of the Sixth Army to use the headquarters of the engineering troops to build positions in the rear. But the General Staff firmly rejected this proposal of the Army. Of course, did not send the Army and construction materials for bunkers. Meanwhile, the Führer's order came in demanding that the engineering troops sent to us to build safe heated bunkers for tanks. This was equally unrealistic. I can vividly imagine how Zeller reacted to these ridiculous fantasies, I said. Everything you've told me is depressing, especially in our predicament. Well, we must be prepared for much more. My interlocutor looked at me carefully. You know, Mr. Colonel, I came here from the personnel department of the General Staff. There I was, sometimes surprised that the top commanders allow themselves to criticize the High Command. But in these 5 weeks, while I was replacing you here, I realized how much damage is done to the troops by ridiculous measures and orders of the Wehrmacht High Command. Yes, that's true, I replied. The credibility of the High Command is being severely tested. It would be good if the officers of the General Staff, who are responsible for such orders, worked for a few months in some army headquarters. Maybe they would finally realize how dangerous it is when the command of troops is based on false assessments of the situation. The gentlemen from the Führer's headquarters have undoubtedly been through military history, strategy, operational training and tactics. Theoretically, they know exactly that a battle can never be won by underestimating the enemy and overestimating their own forces, and that the troops pay dearly for such mistakes of the command, with their blood. I must tell you frankly, after the experience gained in the campaign to the east, there is little of my former respect for the General Staff left. It would be useful if you, having returned to the personnel department, would report your observations to the competent authority. Or perhaps you still intend to command our regiment? My intention is still valid. I was reinforced by my work at Army headquarters. An infantry regiment in the 76th Infantry Division has been vacated. Colonel Abraham has fallen ill. General Rodenberg has requested a replacement. Here's the letter. I've read the document. Fortunately, the illness is not serious. General Rodenberg suggests that the colonel be sent to the rear of the army for a few weeks. We'll discuss that now, but before that, one more question. What's the situation with our officer courses at Suvorov? Unfortunately, we haven't been able to start classes as scheduled. The fighting in the city forced us to postpone the enrollment of cadets. Captain Goebel didn't start classes until the middle of this month. I was not happy about this because we needed infantry officers immediately. I had no reason to reproach my deputy. He was not responsible for this tardiness. I decided to do everything I could to speed up the retraining. And then the thought occurred to me, what if Colonel Abraham was sent to Suvorovsky? He would rest there, and Captain Goebel could consult with him on the training of new officers. Then you could take over the regiment Colonel Abraham used to command. I agree, Mr. Colonel. Will General Paulus and General Schmidt approve? We'll go to the report together tomorrow morning. We'll take the written request to the General Command of the Army for your transfer to the 76th Infantry Division with us. If all goes well, you'll be able to assume your new duties in 2 days. Now I'll let you in on a secret. During my last visit to the personnel department, I raised the question of my release from the adjutant's duties. If Paulus agrees, my successor will be Colonel Sommerfeld, who before the war was adjutant of the GU Army Corps in Dresden. The other day I will talk about it with the commander. In early November, Infantry General Strecker, commander of the Army Corps, operating on the left flank of the army in a large bend of the Don, appeared to Paulus. All divisions in the northern section reported on the movements and concentration of Soviet troops on our left flank and in front of the 3rd Romanian Army, which on October 10th occupied the intermediate line between the 6th Army and the 8th Italian Army. Strecker demanded countermeasures, which were extremely urgent because the 4th Panzer Army operating in the south also noticed the enemy's preparations for an offensive. Army commanders and corps commanders had no doubts about the Russian intentions to encircle the 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army. The commander of Army Group B, General Feldmarschall Weichs, and his Chief of Staff, General of Infantry von Sodenstern, shared the fears of the command of the 6th Army. But they could not convince the Ground Forces High Command and Hitler of this. The High Command simply did not take the 6th Army's reports seriously. It doubted that the Red Army was even capable of thinking about a counter-offensive. Paulus proposed to withdraw the 6th Army behind the Don and deploy it there in a cut-off position to avoid the threatened encirclement. This proposal was rejected, which showed a complete lack of responsibility for the lives of several 100,000 soldiers. I was present when the telephone call from the General Staff went out. Chief of the General Staff, Infantry General Zeitzler, was personally at the machine, and on the orders of Hitler transmitted the following directive. The Red Army is defeated. It no longer has any significant reserves, and therefore unable to take serious offensive action. From this fundamental thesis should be based every time when assessing the enemy. Paulus was shocked by such an erroneous assessment, insulted him and the assignment, made in such a rude form. It is necessary for them in the General Staff still to understand what is being prepared here, he burst out at him. Is it that in Hitler's entourage there remained only pandering, flatterers, approving any nonsense? And yet Paulus obeyed. The commander of the 6th Army was not able to force himself to make an independent decision. Soldiers' obedience took over common sense. Was only created a reserve of the army and placed behind the XI Army Corps west of the Don, southeast of Kletskaya. The reserve consisted of a composite detachment of 1 regiment, the core of which was an anti-tank division, then from parts of the 14th Armoured Division. The next day, as usual, I appeared with a report to General Paulus. Almost without looking at me, the commander briefly thanked for the report. His gaze was fixed on the operational map which lay in front of him on the table. Allow me to ask, Mr. General, how since yesterday the situation in front of our left flank developed? I addressed him. The situation has worsened. The position of the General Staff is simply incomprehensible to me. They imagine that the headquarters, which is located from us at a distance of 2,000 kilometers and more, can better than ours to assess the situation at the front. It's ridiculous. Such an underestimation of the enemy. Something unheard of. If the General Staff does not take immediate measures to cover our flanks, the entire 6th Army will pay for it. After all, we are not the only ones signalling that the preparation of a counter-offensive is becoming more and more obvious. The 4th Panzer Army in its section of the front also observes it. This must be alarming for the stake. Why doesn't the Chief of General Staff come here himself? Here, in the face of the threatening danger, he couldn't just use generalities. That's what I think, Adam. But now everyone's afraid to come here, and Zeitzler won't dare oppose Hitler. He proved it yesterday. How can the Chief of General Staff give such meaningless directives? And personally, too. By firing Halder, Hitler eliminated from his entourage the last general who, at least in military matters, defended his own opinion. As for political goals, there is already no disagreement between Hitler and his generals. Obviously, Hitler wants only collaborators who always give in, like Keitel. The future will show whether Zeitzler will support a strategy built on illusions, or whether he really assesses the strength and capabilities of the Red Army. After a few seconds, he added thoughtfully, "Let's hope for the best. In early October, the Army Command became clear that it will not be possible with extremely exhausted divisions to take Stalingrad before the onset of winter. From this, some conclusions were made. One of them was the relocation of the command post of the army. Golubinski, located on the west bank of the Don, between the crossings at Kalach and Peskovatka, was located unfavourably in terms of transport and communications. Not only was there no railroad there, but also no highways. When looking for a suitable place for the headquarters, the choice fell on Nizhne Chirskaya. Nearby was the terminus of the railroad leading to the west. Not far from there, a road bridge was built across the Don. Finally, from there were direct roads to the Army Corps subordinate to our headquarters. All this spoke in favour of Nizhne Chirskaya as the winter command post of the army. At the beginning of November, the Chief of Communications of the Army reported that the wire communication with the corps and the group of armies was established. The teams sent forward under the direction of the Commandant of the headquarters have already equipped office and living quarters. By order of the Army Commander, I checked how prepared the command post. It was indeed much better and more conveniently located than in Golubinski. The town at the confluence of the Chia River into the Don gave the impression of a clean and well-maintained village. Whitewashed one-storey and two-storey houses stood along the wide streets. Gardens and squares enlivened the look of the town. Almost all the houses were empty. The inhabitants had left the village. Although everything had been done for the transfer of the headquarters, the Chief of Staff was at first slow to move. Schmidt probably feared that the transfer of the army's command post back from Golubinskoye to Nizhne Chirskaya will have a bad effect on the troops who fought hard at the front. Therefore, for the time being, everything was only so prepared that the relocation of the headquarters could take place quickly. But for the time being, the winter command post housed part of the field headquarters and the Army's communications regiment. The Ober-Quartermeister, too, remained for the time being near Kalach, by the railroad leading to Stalingrad. After the crossing of the Don every day more and more aggravated the problem of supplying the Sixth Army. For the delivery of fuel, ammunition and food, there was only a single-gauge railroad that led to Stalingrad from the west through Morozovsk, and the bridge across the Don at Rychkovsky. But the railroad bridge was blown up, so at the station Chir all the cargoes had to be reloaded on motor transport. And by cars these cargoes were delivered across the bridge only to Verkhne Chirskaya, and there they were again sent by rail. One can easily imagine how inconvenient and time-consuming all this was. Often the railroad tracks were occupied by empty trucks and sanitary trains, creating traffic jams. What would happen in winter, when it would be necessary to deliver warm uniforms, fuel and forage for horses, and in addition there would be heavy snowfalls and icy conditions? These questions caused great anxiety. In mid-October, the Sixth Army headquarters was visited by Lieutenant General Wagner, Quartermaster General of the Army. He wanted to familiarise himself with the situation with the supply, and to see if the transportation of necessary supplies could be improved. But he was no help either. Our new Chief of Operations, Colonel Ellep, later told me that General Wagner spoke frankly about the situation created in Hitler's headquarters. None of the generals dare to contradict him. They are all intimidated by the hysterical fits of frenzy of their lord. Wagner himself, in the summer of 1942, pointed out to the Supreme Commander on the lack of fuel and demanded that the planning of military operations coordinated with the state of supply. Hitler cut him short, saying, "I did not expect any other answer from my generals, thank you." We have often heard such stories. But what good did it do? None. The generals scolded Hitler and still participated in his adventure. Thanks to their energetic help, the hysteric could continue the war. One general or another could afford to grumble, but none of them went against Hitler. The generals may have occasionally looked down on the Bohemian Ephrata with contempt, but the fact remains that the generals developed Hitler's war plans, and that thanks to their active support, Hitler went from one adventure to another, sent millions of people to a senseless death. This is the historical guilt and culpability before humanity of the German generalship in World War II. But in making these statements, I was ahead of my own evolution. In those October days of 1942, I was still far from such an understanding of things. True, I felt that all was not well in the mechanism of leadership of the Wehrmacht. At times I was enraged by such boundless amateurism. At times it depressed me. But I did what I thought was my duty. I myself was at the mercy of military tradition and army education, so I was then far from the idea that Paulus, as commander of the Sixth Army, could, by making his own decision, to prevent the impending fatal end. To explain my lack of understanding can also be that in October 1942, I was still only on the threshold of hell. I had to go through all the circles of hell in Stalingrad to rise to a deeper understanding of events. However, even then I had not yet understood everything. About this I will further talk in detail. Among the difficulties of supply, which the Sixth Army directly faced before the onset of the winter of 1942-43 year, included the provision of fodder for several thousand horses. Therefore, General Paulus decided to send all the extra horses to the army rear west of the Don. Left were only those horses which are certainly needed in artillery regiments, artillery infantry units, and in sanitary transport. All others were driven westward and located in villages where there were sufficient supplies of forage, equipped stables and stalls. It was a risky venture. The divisions were deprived of a substantial draft force. But what could be done if we wanted to prevent the animals from starving to death? However, this undertaking later led to the starvation deaths of thousands of German soldiers, and that this would happen did not occur to any of us. In order to save means of transportation, it was also decided to move most of the tanks to the rear of the army. It became clear that tanks are unsuitable for street fighting. The northern and southern sections of the front were stabilized. The fighting became positional in nature. In addition, the tank regiments were badly battered. Almost all tanks, if they were not destroyed altogether, required extensive repairs. To avoid having to transport fuel, spare parts and tools, the Army Command ordered the tanks to be withdrawn from the front and transferred for repair to the area west of the Don. The repair companies had already taken up their winter quarters there. However, the transfer of tank regiments did not come to the transfer of tank regiments because of alarming omens in the northern and southern sections of the front. At the end of October, the Don-Volga interfluve was immersed in thick fog. Air reconnaissance was completely paralyzed. We had no clear idea about the movements of the Soviet troops. At last, the weather came in the fall, and with them came good visibility. Already the first aerial reconnaissance of the northern flank confirmed the correctness of the observations reported by our divisions. With excitement, we looked at aerial photographs. The Red Army has significantly expanded its bridgehead on this side of the Don, mainly in the area of Serafimovich. Many new bridges appeared, partly underwater bridges. Together with Colonel Elklep, we stood in front of a large operational map. From the north, approximately from Voronezh, the front stretched along the Don, gradually turning to the east, crossed the Don south of Shishkin, and reached the Volga north of Rhynok. On the huge, more than 600 kilometers long, flank of the Sixth Army stood front to the north only two of our army corps and poorly equipped Allied armies. Did not inspire calm and the front line south of Stalingrad. Between the 4th Panzer Army and the 4th Romanian Army, the right neighbours of the 6th Army, on the one hand, and the German formations in the Caucasus, on the other a huge gap gaped. On one section of the front, stretching about 400 kilometres, stood strongly stretched one single division, the 16th Motorised Division. Not without reason, it was nicknamed Steppe Fire Department. Parallel was drawn on the map red line of the enemy front. Before the left flank of the 6th Army and before the 3rd Romanian Army, as well as before the right flank of the 4th Panzer Army, were marked accumulations of Soviet units. General Paulus placed one hand on the northern and the other on the southern accumulation of enemy troops. Then he moved his hands, as if he closed the pincers. What was inside the pincers and securely cut off from the outside world were we, our 6th Army. Elklep commented laconically, "If Hitler even now in this dangerous position will spit on our proposals, disaster is imminent." Nervous tension in the army headquarters was growing. After dinner, I escorted Paulus to his apartment. Both of us, apparently, did not notice how we went beyond the village street. Somehow or other, we had been standing on the banks of the Don for some time. Our gazes slid aimlessly over the water surface. Then Paulus broke the silence. "You know my proposals, Adam. Hitler all rejected. The suspension of the offensive at Stalingrad and the withdrawal of the Kharkiv tank corps from the city. He insists on his order of September 12th and requires any means to accelerate the capture of the city. Meanwhile, we are bleeding. But this is not all. Stalingrad could become the Cannes of the Sixth Army. It seemed that the last words he said, addressing himself. For several minutes he stood immersed in his thoughts, as if forgetting about me. Then he ran his right hand across his forehead, as if he wanted to drive away tormenting thoughts. His thin figure straightened. "Let's think about what we can do. When will you place the first group of young officers at our disposal? You know how badly we need them. Dozens of companies are commanded by non-commissioned officers. I was at Suvorov yesterday. At first the young officer candidates were not happy about their transfer to the infantry, but now they are attached to the infantry with all their hearts. Captain Goebel also reported that they had made great progress. I can only confirm this on the basis of my own impressions. Unfortunately, the classes started late. Graduation will be at the earliest by the end of the month. I must say that Colonel Abraham's assignment to Suvorovsky had good consequences. His original humour and his vast experience are worth more than gold. Besides, his health was better there. It's a pity that I agreed to open the officers' school later than expected. In any case, try to have the preparations finished by November 30th. We headed for the village. We were shivering. Why? Was it from the fact that the evening was cold, or from terrible premonitions? The command post received the usual reports. There was nothing extraordinary in them. How long would it last? At 2200 hours, I contacted the Corps, talked to them about losses, awards, promotions, taking officer positions. It's all the same, I thought. In mid-November, I needed to go to the 71st Infantry Division. With the commander of one of its regiments, Colonel Roske, I had long been acquainted. By the beginning of the war, we were both teachers of tactics at the military school in Dresden. Now Roske was with his headquarters in Stalingrad and his regiment, on the very banks of the Volga. I went there with Roske. For the first time I saw the appearance of the city, destroyed by aircraft and street fighting. I remembered the words of Schiller. Horror looks out of the empty window sockets. Ruins, ruins everywhere. Soldiers were hiding under them in cellars. Shell craters and piles of debris made the once smooth streets almost impassable. Shards of glass, window frames, car parts, wrecked vehicles, broken beds, remnants of furniture, cooking utensils, stoves, electrical wires, scraps of cable. An unimaginable mixture of all sorts of damaged, mangled things. Roski and I struggled to make our way forward. No one could tell exactly where or how the front lay in these ruins. Every hour it could happen that enemy assault groups would suddenly appear behind the backs of our soldiers. Behind every ruin, at every crossroads, death lurked. Roske was a good guide among the ruins of the city, covered with piles of rubble and debris. After about half an hour it was possible to look around. We took shelter in a crevice on the western, steeply steepening bank of the Volga. The mighty river was more than 2 kilometres wide here. It looked more like a lake. A light fog descended. We could see the faint outlines of the opposite bank only by straining our eyesight. To our right, in the middle of the mighty river, rose a large wooded island. Its southern edge was hidden from our eyes. Roske told us that at night our posts were advanced to the Volga itself. Now, in the daytime, there was not a single craft or boat on the river. German air observers had nothing to do. The more to do were the dive bombers, which dive-bombed the eastern shore and the island from on high. Their targets were Russian mortar positions and troop concentrations. On them they dropped their bombs and fired their airborne weapons. I stood amazed at the sheer size of this river. After the steppe expanses, these river distances, and there was a huge city with up to 600,000 inhabitants. At its largest factories, the number of workers reached tens of thousands. How life probably boiled here, in this city, located by the greatest European river, between the Caucasus and Moscow. The crackling of a machine gun interrupted my thoughts. Hand grenades exploded to our left. With a deafening roar, the artillery entered the battle. While we were standing here in the shelter of the trench, a few dozen meters away from us, shells were tearing human bodies to pieces. Suddenly it was quiet. It happens a lot, Roska said. A short firefight breaks out most of the time in connection with some operation of assault groups. During the day, there is complete silence on the Volga. Positions come alive at dusk. With field binoculars, you can make out Krasnaya Sloboda on the other side. Our bombers have already pelted this village with shells countless times. But as soon as the first haze descends over the river in the afternoon, people and ammunition begin to be loaded onto ships there. The Russians are trying to cross to the western bank in the darkness of night. That's when the terrible spectacle begins. Fairy light illuminates the water signal flares. Searchlights send beams, surveying the surface of the river. If a ship or boat is caught in these streams of light, machine guns and guns of all kinds start firing. Airplanes drop bombs and open fire with airborne weapons on a swooping flight. Nevertheless, most of the ships reach the shore. According to intelligence, we know that in mid-October an entire rifle division was crossed in one night. Only on particularly bright moonlit nights the Russians restrict movement on the river. Roski's regiment, like the entire 71st Infantry Division and its neighbours on the left and right, had been engaged in fierce close combat for weeks. Its persistence was evidenced by one episode my companion told me on the way back to the command post. The assault groups of our left neighbour had penetrated one building and forced the Russians out of the lower floor. But on the top floor, the enemy is still holding out. For many days, our men have been fighting by all means, but they have not been able to push the Russians back. It is simply a mystery to us how they are supplied there. They should have starved to death there long ago and used up all their ammunition. But nothing of the sort. A handful of Russians are not thinking of surrendering. Nor did it think of it during the weeks that followed. The small, courageous garrison held on until the German troops in that area of the city were destroyed or captured. We later learned from Soviet military history that this was Sergeant Pavlov's group. Again, Paulus asked the General Staff for permission to leave Stalingrad and take the 6th Army to the other side of the Don, and again received a refusal. The offensive of fatally exhausted divisions gradually came to a standstill. The strength of our soldiers was running out. The last attacks in November cost thousands of lives. Other thousands of soldiers were crippled. A few square meters of ruins. That's all that could be recaptured. The prospect of taking the city became something unimaginably distant. But repeated appeals to the main command had one consequence. The General Staff finally had to agree to some defensive measures on the northern flank of the 6th Army. Tank corps, which had lately been operating on the 6th Army's right flank in the city, transferred 2 of its divisions to LI Army Corps. Its 3rd Division, the 29th Motorized Division, became the reserve of Army Group B. The vacated corps' headquarters was transferred on November 15th to an area behind the front of the 3rd Romanian Army. It was subordinated to the 22nd Armoured Division and the 1st Romanian Armoured Division. The commander of the XXXX VTTI Tank Corps was Lieutenant General Geim, with whom I had long cooperated willingly. Shortly before that, Geim had served as Chief of Staff of the 6th Army. He was to use the German Panzer Division as a corset, pulling together the 3rd Romanian Army, which was threatened by an offensive prepared by the enemy. General Paulus did not attach much importance to the fact that Heim fell into disfavour. His distrust did not apply to the corps commander, but to those troops who were Heim's subordinate. 1st Romanian Panzer Division, he told me, armed with light French and Czech trophy tanks. The personnel is not sufficiently trained and not fired. The 22nd German Panzer Division severely thinned during the fighting. But even its remnants Heim cannot fully dispose of. Half of its tank regiment command of Army Group B transferred to another area. Of course, the defensive measures outlined by the rate could not dispel the serious anxiety of the Army Commander and Chief of Staff. Paulus spoke to me about it on November 15th. The Commander again pointed to the task assigned to Lieutenant General Heim. I consider more than superficial opinion of those who think that Heim can with half of one division to prevent the breakthrough of the Russians, when at last the High Command and the General Staff will learn to correctly assess the forces of the enemy. So you consider insufficient those forces that operate behind our left flank? Of course they are insufficient. After all, that's why I asked permission to withdraw the Ixiv Tank Corps from Stalingrad. But even this was rejected by the General Staff, although in the city from the tanks are not exactly no use. With all this I simply cannot reconcile, Mr. General. Such wrong decisions literally provoke a catastrophe. Don't be so quick to judge, Adam. 50 Tank Corps I ordered to prepare for the withdrawal of tank regiments and anti-tank units of the 16th and 24th Panzer Divisions, so that they, on my order, if necessary, they could be immediately transferred to our left flank west of the Don. And how will things go in the south? Will the 4th Panzer Army be able to hold its ground when the Russians rush forward? As a matter of fact, there is no tank army there anymore. It was forced to give up almost all of its tank units and one infantry division. She kept the Romanian infantry divisions, which, it is true, sometimes fought courageously, but poorly equipped and poorly armed. Everything depends on the strength of the enemy. If he advances in large and capable units, and in the south, the matter may come to a disaster. I fear the worst there, too, if the High Command does not plant fully manned divisions. But we must not allow panic to set in. I quite understand that. But are we to passively watch the noose being thrown around our necks, Mr. General? Our divisions simply can't give anything more. Many do not have even half their combat strength. All these conclusions can't help us, Adam. Remember how many times this year we've already met with difficulties. Besides, you know the orders of the General Staff. They're binding on me as a soldier. I also require my subordinates to follow my orders unconditionally. That was the end of the conversation. But Paulus was not relieved of his worries. Tirelessly he worked, checked reports, often visited the troops. But he could not change much. The fate of the 6th Army was decided in the Führer's headquarters, and Paulus did not challenge her orders. On November 16th, the first snow fell. The icy wind whistled in the steppe, penetrating through our light overcoats. Our caps and boots also did not protect us well from the cold. As a matter of fact, it was time to learn lessons from the sad experience of the winter of 1941-42. But even in mid-November, the 6th Army did not have the appropriate winter uniforms. Paulus demanded it even when he realized that operations in the city cannot be completed before the onset of cold weather. Quartermaster General of the Army shared the opinion of the commander of our army. Hitler, on the contrary, believed that for the Eastern Front is enough for the usual winter clothing, because the National Socialist charitable organizations have already begun a mass collection of winter clothes for the soldiers of the Eastern Front, and all Germans participated in it. Indeed, the population was ready to donate all sorts of clothing capable of protecting against the cold and icy winds. In Germany, huge boxes were filled with such things. However, when we were suddenly overtaken by cold weather near Stalingrad, almost nothing of the collected items arrived at the front, and there were few of them in the rear warehouses. Ober-Quartermeister of the armies tried to speed up the delivery of uniforms, but his efforts led to almost nothing. There was not enough transport, and the spaces to be overcome were huge. From Milerovo, the main supply base of the 6th Army, reported that when they opened the first wagons filled with winter clothes, found a strange picture. Along with woolen and knitted things in the wagons were found hundreds of ladies' coats, muffs, caracul mantos, and other furs, including expensive things, which, however, at the front had no value. Apparently, no one looked through and did not take away the clothes that were surrendered by the population. They were simply sent onward. Let the army think what to do with it, they said. Schmidt was furious to learn of this negligence, but there was nothing he could do about it. The guilty were hiding in the rear, in the heat, 2,000 kilometers from Stalingrad. The division intendants were ordered to distribute the few usable winter clothes only to the fighting units. But only about 1 out of 5 soldiers in the trenches and dugouts of the northern section of the front, without stoves, without fuel, deep in the snow-covered steppe, where the freezing cold Nordost raged. Meanwhile, piles of alarming reports were already piling up in the army headquarters. Our nerves were strained to the extreme. It became finally clear that in the near future the Soviet counter-offensive would begin. And if it turns out to be successful? If the XI Army Corps and the 3rd Romanian Army do not hold their positions, what would happen then?